The morning Louise Bailey walked into the Caldwell, Kansas land auction house in the summer of 1882, she had exactly $43 sewn into the hem of her skirt, a dead husband's name on a deed that wasn't worth the paper it was printed on, and the unshakable feeling that the entire town was waiting for her to fail. She had been told, 3 times already that morning, that a woman had no business bidding on land. The first time by her neighbor Elias Cobb, who'd said it with a sympathetic smile that barely concealed his satisfaction. The second time by the bank manager, a round-faced man named Whitfield who had denied her a loan application with such practiced efficiency she suspected he'd rehearsed the refusal. And the third time by her own reflection in the warped glass of the auction house window, which showed a 26-year-old widow in a brown calico dress with dust on her boots and grief still sitting fresh behind her eyes. But Louise Bailey walked through that door anyway. The auction house smelled of sawdust, tobacco, and the particular brand of masculine ambition that clung to rooms where fortunes changed hands. Men packed every bench, shoulder to shoulder, their hats pushed back or held in their laps, their boots leaving mud tracks across the raw plank floor. The auctioneer, a wiry man named Calvin Pratt, stood at a podium near the front with a ledger open before him and a gavel that he tapped against his palm in a nervous rhythm. Louise found a seat near the back, the only woman in the room, and she sat down with the careful dignity of someone who would not be moved. She had come for Parcel 7. Parcel 7 was 40 acres of bottom land along Bluff Creek, land that her husband Thomas had nearly purchased the previous autumn before a combination of bad investments, a dishonest business partner named Gerald Hooper, and a fever that had taken him in November had left her with nothing but debts and a rented house whose landlord was already making pointed remarks about the calendar. The land had reverted to auction after the previous owner, old Silas Marsh, had died without heirs. It was good land, rich soil near the creek, enough timber for a proper house, enough flat acreage for winter wheat and a kitchen garden that could feed a small family and produce surplus. It was also, Louise had been warned by the county clerk, land that Gerald Hooper intended to purchase himself. She spotted Hooper near the front. He was a thick-necked man of 50 with a black coat that was just expensive enough to suggest he had money and just ill-fitting enough to suggest he hadn't always had it. He sat beside 2 other men she recognized as his hired hands, men who occasionally rode through the county with the air of people whose purpose was to make other people uncomfortable. Louise pressed her hands flat against her thighs and told herself she was not afraid. The auction began with the northernmost parcels, flat grassland that the cattle ranchers wanted and the farmers didn't. The bidding went fast, voices calling out numbers that climbed with competitive speed. Louise watched, learning the rhythm of it. She had never attended a land auction before. Thomas had handled such things, and before Thomas, her father had handled such things, and the understanding that she was now required to handle such things herself was still settling into her bones like a change of weather. 3 parcels sold, then 4, then 5 and 6. Calvin Pratt shuffled his papers and announced Parcel 7. Louise's heart moved somewhere up into her throat. Gerald Hooper sat forward on his bench, and that was the moment David Alden walked through the door. He did not walk in with the casual late arrival of a man who had misjudged the time. He walked in the way a man walks when he knows exactly how late he is and has decided the situation does not require him to hurry. He was tall, somewhere around 30, with dark hair that needed cutting and the kind of jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same limestone that built the bluffs outside of town. He wore a black hat and a black coat and a Colt Peacemaker on his right hip, and the room noticed him the way a room notices when the temperature changes. Louise noticed him too, but she had a parcel to bid on. Parcel 7, Calvin Pratt announced, adjusting his spectacles. 40 acres along Bluff Creek, surveyed and recorded. We'll open the bidding at $25. 25, Gerald Hooper said immediately, not bothering to raise his hand. I have 25. Do I hear 30? 30, Louise said. The room went quiet in that particular way rooms go quiet when something unexpected happens. Several men turned to look at her. Gerald Hooper turned to look at her. His expression moved through surprise and settled into contempt with the efficiency of a man who had traveled that road before. 30 from the lady in the back, Calvin Pratt said, his voice carrying the professional neutrality of a man who had seen stranger things than a widow bidding on land, though his expression suggested he hadn't. 40, Hooper said, louder than necessary. Louise counted what she had. 43, she said, and she was aware as she said it that she was showing all her cards, that anyone who could count knew this was her limit. Hooper smiled. It was not a kind smile. 50, he said. The room exhaled collectively. Louise sat very still. She had known this was a possibility. She had lain awake thinking about this possibility. She had $43 and a dead husband's debts and a landlord who was not a patient man. And she sat in that auction house with the specific stillness of a person refusing to let anyone see them break. "Do I hear 55? Calvin Pratt asked, glancing toward Louise with the practiced sympathy of someone whose job required him to be neutral. No one spoke. "Going once at 50, $100. The voice came from the back of the room, not Louise's corner but near the door. The tall man in the black coat had not taken a seat. He stood with his arms loosely at his sides, hat pushed back just slightly, and he had spoken with the calm of someone announcing the time. The room turned as one. Gerald Hooper's smile disappeared. Calvin Pratt blinked. "I'm sorry, sir, I didn't catch your name for the record." "David Alden," the man said. There was a small ripple through the room, a murmur that ran from front to back like wind through tall grass. Some men recognized the name. Louise did not, but she watched the way Hooper's two companions shifted in their seats and filed that away. $100 from Mr. Alden, Calvin Pratt said, his voice having recovered its professional steadiness. "Do I hear 110? Gerald Hooper was not a man who was easily beaten. He turned in his seat and looked at David Alden with the expression of a man taking the measure of an obstacle. He turned back to the front. 120, he said. 150, David Alden said, without hesitation. And then he looked at Louise Bailey, not the way men had been looking at her all morning, with pity or dismissal or calculation. He looked at her the way you look at someone when you want them to know, without any words being exchanged, that you understand the situation and you are choosing to stand in it with them. His eyes were dark, steady, serious. They did not waver. Louise felt something move through her that she could not immediately name. It was not entirely comfortable. Gerald Hooper pushed to his feet. 200, he said, and there was a threat in his voice that did not require explanation. David Alden had not looked away from Louise. 250, he said, still looking at her. The room had gone so quiet that Louise could hear the fly buzzing against the window beside her bench. Hooper's face had gone red. He turned fully around to face Alden. "You don't know what you're getting into, son," he said. "Mr. Pratt," David Alden said calmly, "I believe you're conducting an auction." Calvin Pratt cleared his throat. $250. Do I hear 260? Gerald Hooper stared at Alden for a long moment. His two companions leaned in and murmured something. Hooper's jaw worked. He looked at the front. He looked at Alden. He sat back down. "Going once at 250. Going twice. Sold to Mr. David Alden." The gavel came down. Louise realized she had been holding her breath. She let it out slowly. David Alden finally looked away from her and walked to the front of the room to settle with Calvin Pratt. Louise sat very still on her bench in the back of the auction house, surrounded by men who were already moving on to the next parcel, already forgetting her presence, and she tried to understand what had just happened. A stranger had just purchased the land she needed. A stranger whose name had made a room full of hardened men go quiet. A stranger who had bid once, spent $250 he had apparently brought with him in cash, and had spent the entire time looking at her as though she were the only fixed point in a spinning room. She did not know whether to be grateful or terrified, and she suspected the honest answer was both. Outside, after the auction concluded, the July sun was fierce and direct, the kind of Caldwell summer sun that had no patience for shade. Louise stood on the wooden sidewalk and watched the dust rise from the street where a freight wagon was pulling through, and she was still working out what to say when she heard boots on the planks behind her. "Miss Bailey," she turned. David Alden stood a few feet away, hat in hand now, and up close she could see that his eyes were brown, the particular warm brown of creek water over pale stones, and that the seriousness she had noticed from across the room was not coldness but something more like careful attention. "It's Mrs. Bailey," she said, because she was not ready to let go of that title yet, even though what it protected her from in this town she could not have precisely named. "Mrs. Bailey," he corrected himself without embarrassment. "My name is David Alden. I apologize for the intrusion this morning." Louise studied him for a moment. "That land is not yours to apologize for. You purchased it fair." "I did," he agreed. "That's what I wanted to speak with you about." Louise waited. David Alden looked at her with that same steady attention. "I came to this auction with the intention of purchasing bottom land along Bluff Creek. I did not come knowing you would be there or what was at stake for you, but I noticed and I made a decision." He paused. "I would like to offer you the land." Louise stared at him. "I beg your pardon." "Not as a gift," he said quickly, and she understood from the speed of the correction that he had anticipated this reaction. "As a purchase at the price you were willing to pay, $43. You can pay me over time if that's easier or all at once. The terms are yours to decide." Louise felt the heat of the day press against her face. She felt the dust in her throat. She felt $43 in the hem of her skirt and a month's overdue rent in the back of her mind, and she felt something else, something complicated and protective rising in her chest. "You spent $250, she said. "I did. And you want to sell it to me for $43. "I want you to have what you came for," he said simply. Louise looked at him for a long moment. He did not look away. She had the distinct impression that David Alden was a man who said precisely what he meant and then waited patiently for the world to catch up. "Why?" she asked. Something shifted in his expression, just barely, the way still water moves when something passes beneath the surface. "Because Gerald Hooper doesn't strike me as a man who needs another 40 acres, he said. It wasn't the whole answer. Louise was perceptive enough to know it wasn't the whole answer. But it was a true answer, and in her current circumstances, true answers were rare enough to be significant. "I don't know you," she said. "No," he agreed. "In this town that matters. I understand." Louise looked out at the street where the dust was settling back down from the freight wagon's passage, where two men outside the general store were watching their conversation with the focused interest of people who had nothing better to do and would describe this exchange to 6 others by nightfall. "I will think about it," she said. David Alden nodded. "I'm staying at the Drovers Hotel on Main. I'll be in Caldwell for the rest of the week." He put his hat back on his head with the unhurried motion of a man who was comfortable in his own skin. "It was a pleasure to meet you, Mrs. Bailey." He walked back toward the auction house, presumably to complete his paperwork, and Louise stood on the wooden sidewalk with the July sun on her face, and the entirely unexpected sensation that the day had become considerably more complicated than it had been that morning. She walked home along 3rd Street, past the livery stable and the hardware store and the Methodist church, and she thought about 40 acres and $250 and brown eyes that did not look away. She thought about Thomas, who had been dead 8 months now, and about how much simpler it would have been if he had simply stayed alive. She thought about the way Gerald Hooper had looked at her in the auction house, with that specific dismissal that men with power and bad intentions reserved for people they considered obstacles rather than people. She arrived at her rented house, which was a small clapboard structure with a vegetable garden that was doing adequately in the dry summer and a well that needed work, and she sat down at her kitchen table and spread out the papers she had been organizing for months. Thomas's debts were listed in a column in her careful handwriting. Against them she had placed her assets, The $43, the furniture, the horse, the vegetable garden's projected yield. The columns did not balance. They had not balanced for 8 months, and each month the gap widened slightly. Whitfield at the bank had made it clear that credit was not available to her. The charitable women of the Methodist Church had provided meals and prayers in the immediate weeks after Thomas's death, but charity in a frontier town had a natural lifespan, and she had already outlived its generosity. What she needed was the land. Not as a gesture from a stranger, not as charity with a different name, but as a foundation. Bottom land along Bluff Creek, with its rich soil and reliable water access, could be planted in wheat by fall, and she had already spoken to 3 neighboring farms about a shared harvest agreement. It was a real plan built on real arithmetic. She just needed the land to execute it. She sat with this for a long time. Then she put on her good hat, the dark blue one with the practical brim, and she walked to the Drovers Hotel. The lobby smelled of pipe tobacco and kerosene, and the particular weariness of a building that had absorbed too many conversations. The man at the desk, a young fellow named Archie who was barely old enough to shave, looked up from his ledger with barely concealed surprise when Louise walked in. "Mrs. Bailey," he said. "I'm looking for Mr. Alden," she said. "Would you tell him Louise Bailey is here to speak with him?" Archie sent a boy upstairs and returned with David Alden 2 minutes later, and he came down the stairs without his coat, in his shirt sleeves, which in 1882 was a degree of informality that indicated he had not expected visitors and was honest enough not to pretend he had. "Mrs. Bailey," he said with evident surprise. "I've thought about it," she said. "I have a proposition." He gestured toward the small sitting area near the front window, and they sat across from each other in horsehair chairs that had seen better decades, and Louise Bailey told David Alden about her plan. She told him about the wheat and the harvest agreement with the neighboring farms, and her projection for what the yield could produce in the first year. She told him about the timber along the creek and her plan to build a small but serviceable house. She told him about the well she intended to dig, and the kitchen garden and the chickens she would acquire in the spring. She told him all of this with the precision and calm of someone who had spent months organizing information into columns, because that was exactly what she had done. David Alden listened. He did not interrupt. He did not look at the window or at the door or at his hands. He looked at her with that steady, careful attention, and when she finished he was quiet for a moment. "You've worked this out in considerable detail," he said. "I have had time," she said. "I can see that." He leaned forward slightly, elbows on his knees. "May I ask you something?" "You may ask." "Why did you come here to me? You could have thanked me and walked away. You don't know me." "You have, as you said, no reason to trust me." Louise looked at him directly. "Because you spent $250 on my behalf without being asked, and then offered the land to me at 43. That's either the act of a very good man or a very dangerous one, and in either case I thought I should find out which before I made any decisions." The corner of his mouth moved. Not quite a smile, but the beginning of one. "And what's your assessment?" "I haven't made it yet," she said. "I've been talking for 10 minutes. I haven't heard enough from you." He looked at her, and this time there was something in his expression that was warmer than the serious attention of before, something that looked almost like the beginning of delight. "Fair enough," he said. David Alden told her that he had been born in Missouri, in a town she had heard of, and that he had come to Kansas 4 years ago following a period in his life that he described in careful, measured terms as having involved decisions he was not proud of. He had worked cattle drives for 2 years, which explained the calluses on his hands and the particular way he moved, the way men who had spent years on horseback carry their balance differently from men who had not. He had saved money and had been looking, for the past year, for land to purchase. He was 31 years old and had no family living and intended, he said, to build something that was entirely his own. He told her this plainly, without performance, without the polished edges that men sometimes put on their stories when they wanted to impress. He told her the way someone tells things when they have decided, for reasons that are not entirely clear even to them, to be honest. When he finished, they sat in the horsehair chairs, with the July afternoon coming in golden through the hotel window, and the street noise from outside drifting in with it. What were the decisions? Louise asked. He looked at her. The ones you weren't proud of, she said, a pause longer than the others. I rode for a man who did not always do right by the people whose land he wanted. I delivered messages that were threats. I stood outside doors to make conversations more persuasive. He met her eyes. I was not violent, I want you to understand that, but I was the reason some people were afraid, and that's its own kind of damage. Louise absorbed this. Did you stop? I stopped. Why? Because a woman in a town called Ellsworth looked me in the eye when I delivered a message to her husband, and she wasn't afraid, and I realized that I wanted to be the kind of man that a person like her didn't need to be afraid of. He paused. Her husband was a farmer. He lost his land anyway. I have thought about that woman many times since then. Louise was quiet for a moment. Outside, a horse nickered and someone shouted a greeting across the street, and the ordinary sounds of a Kansas afternoon went on without them. Gerald Hooper, she said. You know who he is. I know what he is, David corrected. Men like him have a pattern that's not hard to recognize once you've worked for one. He arranged for my husband's business partner to cheat him, Louise said. Thomas never had proof, but I believe it. And Hooper knew that Thomas was interested in that parcel. That's why he wanted it, not because he needs it, as you said, but because it was Thomas's. David Alden looked at her with something that was not pity but was adjacent to it, something more like recognition. And now it's yours. Now it's yours, she said, legally. Which is why, he said quietly, you came here. A beat of silence. I would like to purchase the land, Louise said. Not at $43 because that is charity and I will not take charity. I will pay you the fair price over time, 2 years, with what the first wheat harvest produces. I will put it in writing and have it witnessed, and you will have a lien on the property until it is paid in full. David Alden sat back in his chair. He looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at her. You drive a harder bargain than most men I've sat across from, he said. Most men you've sat across from had other options, Louise replied. He was quiet for a moment, and then the corner of his mouth moved again, further this time, into something that was unmistakably a smile, genuine and a little surprised. The kind of smile that happens when something catches you off guard pleasantly. All right, Mrs. Bailey, he said. We have a deal. They went together to the land office the following morning and had the agreement drawn up properly, with Calvin Pratt as a witness since he was a neutral party to both of them and had a reputation for honest record-keeping. Gerald Hooper was not there, but word traveled in Caldwell the way it always did, and by noon several people had mentioned to Louise that Hooper had been seen speaking to his men with an expression that was not pleasant to observe. Louise moved onto the land 2 weeks later in early August, with her horse and her furniture and her $43, which was now intact again, because David Alden had insisted on the lien arrangement and accepted no money up front. She set up in the small shelter that old Sela's Marsh had built near the creek, a single room with a roof that held and a fireplace that worked, and she began. She did not see David Alden again for 3 weeks. When she did, it was by accident, or what appeared to be accident. She was working the eastern edge of the property, marking where she wanted fence posts set, when she heard a horse on the trail along the creek and looked up to find David Alden riding a gray horse with the unhurried pace of a man out for the morning. He pulled up when he saw her. Mrs. Bailey, he said. Mr. Alden. She straightened, pressing a hand against the small of her back where the morning's work had made itself felt. Are you inspecting your investment? I am riding along Bluff Creek because it is a pleasant morning, he said, and the trail runs through your property, which I should have mentioned when we drew up the agreement. I apologize for the trespass. Louise looked at him. He sat his horse with the ease of a man who had spent years in the saddle, not moving unnecessarily, simply present. You're not trespassing, she said. The trail is a county road. Technically, he said. Technically is how land law works. Something passed between them, something light and almost amused, and it was different from their conversation in the hotel, more comfortable, the way a second conversation with someone is different from the first even when both are good. "How is the work going?" he asked. Louise looked at her fence line markers. "I've had better weeks," she said honestly. "The northeast corner is rocky, which the survey did not entirely capture. And I have had some trouble with the well." He got down from the gray horse. He did this without asking permission, which might have annoyed her if the gesture had felt presumptuous, but it did not feel presumptuous. It felt like a person who saw a practical problem and was considering whether they could help. "May I look at the well?" She took him to it. He looked at it with the practical eye of a man who had dug and worked wells before, examined the timber casing and the depth of the water, and the way the ground sloped nearby, and he made 3 specific suggestions that were clearly and verifiably correct. She did not thank him effusively. She said, "That's useful," because it was, and he nodded as though that was sufficient. He stayed for 2 hours, helping with fence posts because he was there and the work was there, and neither of them saw a reason to be foolish about it. They did not talk a great deal while they worked. Louise had never found silence uncomfortable, and David Alden appeared to share this quality. They worked with the easy coordination of people who are paying attention to the same thing. And when he left in the late morning, he said he would come by again if the trail was convenient, and she said she would not bar the county road, and that was how it started. He came back the next week, and the week after, and the week after that. He was doing his own work. He had purchased a different parcel, farther up the creek from Louise, and he was building there with the methodical pace of a man who knew how to build things correctly. He would stop by on his way back from town sometimes, or on his way to, and they would talk for a while at the edge of the property or inside old Sela's Marsh's shelter if the weather was bad. And the conversations became the kind of conversations that happen between 2 people who are both observant and honest and have decided, without saying so explicitly, to find out who the other one is. He told her about the cattle drives, the years moving through Kansas and the Indian Territory with thousands of cattle and a dozen men, and the particular vastness of a plains landscape that could make a person feel both very small and very certain about what was important. He told her about the night a stampede had cost the trail boss half the herd in 3 weeks of work, about sitting watch under a sky so full of stars it seemed impossible, about the way a man who had been cruel with the cattle had quietly left the drive at the next town, and no one mentioned him again. Louise told him about Ohio, where she had grown up, the daughter of a school teacher, a childhood that had been orderly and modest and genuinely happy. She told him about meeting Thomas Bailey at a church social when she was 20 and marrying him at 21 and following him west because he was full of plans, and she had loved the plans as much as she had loved him, which was perhaps a cautionary note she had not recognized at the time. She told him about Kansas, which had surprised her, which was bigger and emptier and harsher than she had imagined, which had demanded from her a recalibration of what she considered herself capable of. "Do you regret coming west?" he asked one afternoon in September when they were sitting on the bank of Bluff Creek with the cottonwoods beginning to turn and the creek running clear and low in the late summer. Louise thought about this honestly, which was the only way she thought about anything. "No," she said. "I miss Ohio sometimes. I miss my mother particularly. But this," she gestured, a small motion that encompassed the land and the creek and the sky above it, "this is mine. Not because a husband brought me to it. Because I stayed when staying was hard." David looked out at the creek. "That matters," he said. "It does to me," she said. A pause. The creek ran quietly. Somewhere in the cottonwoods a bird moved branch to branch. "Louise," he said, and it was the first time he had used her given name and they both noticed it. She looked at him. "I would like to continue coming here," he said, "not as a lien holder, not as a neighbor passing on a county road. I would like to come because I want to." The September light was the golden, slightly melancholy light of a season moving toward its close, and Louise Bailey sat on the bank of Bluff Creek and looked at David Alden and felt the specific complexity of a person who has been very sad for a while beginning, against their careful judgment, to be less sad. "I know," she said. "I've known for a while. And—" He said. She was quiet for a moment. "And I think you should continue coming," she said, "and I think we should be careful about what that means." "Careful how?" "Careful like people who have been burned before," she said. "Careful like people who have more to lose than they let on." He looked at her steadily. "I understand that," he said. "I would not have it any other way." The autumn moved in with its particular Kansas urgency. The way the seasons on the plains do not linger politely, but arrive and press their claims with force. Louise planted her winter wheat in October, working from before dawn until the light failed, and David came on Saturdays to help with the heaviest of the work and stayed into the evenings, when the work was done, and the lamplight was on in old Silas Marsh's shelter, and the smell of Louise's cooking made the small room something different from what it was. He helped her mend the roof before the first cold came. He brought lumber from the mill in town, from the money he was earning working part-time at the livery in Caldwell while his own land work proceeded, and he did not frame this as charity but as practical necessity, as the roof needed mending and he had the lumber, and both their interests were served by the land being properly maintained. She did not let him pretend, though. "You're courting me," she said one October evening, standing in the middle of the room with the direct simplicity that was entirely characteristic of her. He set down the hammer he was holding. "Yes," he said, "I am. Why didn't you say so?" "Because you told me to be careful, and I thought you needed the time." Louise looked at him. "I did," she said, "but I think I've had enough of it." He crossed the room and he took her hand carefully, with the particular gentleness that very strong people sometimes have, and he held it for a moment without saying anything, and Louise felt the warmth of his hand and the steadiness of it, and something in her that had been locked since November of the previous year moved slightly, like ice in a river at the first suggestion of spring. "I would like to court you properly," he said. "With your permission." "You have it," she said. Gerald Hooper had not forgotten about Parcel 7. This became apparent in early November when two of his men rode along the fence line that Louise had finally, with effort and with David's help, completed. They rode slowly, the way men ride when they want their presence noted rather than when they have anywhere to go, and they stopped at the east corner for a long time before moving on. Louise watched them from the shelter door with her rifle across her arm, not raised, not threatening, simply present, and they looked at her and she looked at them, and after a while they rode on. She told David about it that Saturday. His jaw tightened. "Has he spoken to you directly?" "No." "Has he done anything to the property?" "Not yet." David was quiet for a moment. She could see him working through something, deciding something. "I know men like Hooper," he said. "He won't act directly. He'll try to make the situation uncomfortable until you leave." "He doesn't know me very well then," Louise said. "No," David said, and there was something in his voice that was warm and proud and a little fierce, all at once. She went to the county sheriff the following week, a steady man named Frank Briggs who had been in Caldwell long enough to know everyone and diplomatic enough to have survived knowing them. She told him about Hooper's men riding the fence line. Briggs listened with the attention of a man who took his job seriously, made notes in his book, and told her that if anything happened on the property she was to send word to him immediately. "Hooper is a powerful man," he said, not as an apology but as a fact. "So I understand," Louise said. "I am a stubborn woman. I thought you should know both things." Briggs had the kind of face that didn't smile easily, and so when it did the effect was significant. "I'll keep an eye out, Mrs. Bailey," he said. One morning in late November, Louise came out of the shelter before dawn to find that the fence along the south edge of the property had been cut. Not broken, which might have been weather or animals, but cut, 4 clean sections of wire lying in the frozen grass as though they had never been strung. She went to town and told Sheriff Briggs. She stopped at the drover's hotel on the way back and told David. His expression went very still in the way it went still when he was thinking carefully. "This is escalating," he said. "Yes. Briggs will do what he can, but Hooper has money and money moves faster than the law in a town this size." He looked at her. "Louise, I need to say something." "Say it." "I want to be there at the property more than on Saturdays." He met her eyes directly. "Not for appearances, not to take over. I want to be present because you are there and because what's threatening what you've built matters to me as much as my own land." Louise looked at him for a long moment. She thought about what it would mean, what the town would say, what she herself thought about it in the honest privacy of her own mind. "It is too soon for you to be living there," she said. "I want to be clear about what I'm willing to say and not say." "I know. But you could build a camp on the south edge of your property," she said, "which borders mine. And you could work late and start early." He understood what she was offering and what she was protecting. "All right," he said. He built a camp on the south edge of his property, which shared a fence line with the north edge of hers, and he worked from there in the days that followed. The fence that had been cut was repaired. Nothing was cut again. December came, cold and hard, with a blue norther that blew through Caldwell for 3 days and left the creek frozen and the ground like iron. Louise went into town for supplies on a December morning, when the sky was the specific bone white of a plains winter, and she had just come out of the general store with flour and salt and lamp oil when Gerald Hooper stepped into her path. He was accompanied by a single man, one of the two who had ridden her fence line, a broad-shouldered man with a flat face who stood just behind and to the left of Hooper like punctuation. "Mrs. Bailey," Hooper said, "I've been meaning to speak with you." "Mr. Hooper," she said, and kept her voice entirely level. He made a show of being pleasant, of being a neighbor having a conversation, but his eyes were not pleasant, and his voice had a controlled quality that suggested the pleasantness was a garment he'd put on over something else. He told her that the winter was hard, that a widow alone on bottom land was a difficult situation, that he had given thought to her circumstances and had a proposal that might be of benefit to her. He wanted to buy the land. He offered her $120. Louise stood on the frozen boardwalk of Caldwell, Kansas in December of 1882, with flour and salt and lamp oil in her arms, and she looked at Gerald Hooper with the particular clarity of a woman who has been underestimated so many times it has stopped being an insult and become a piece of useful information. "The land is not for sale," she said. His pleasantness thinned slightly. "The winter will be long," he said. "A woman alone." "I am not alone," she said simply. This was more truth than calculation, and Hooper heard it. His eyes moved in a quick assessment. "Alden," he said. Louise said nothing. "Alden won't be there forever," Hooper said. "Men like that move on." "Good day, Mr. Hooper," Louise said, and she walked past him with her flour and her salt and her lamp oil, and she did not look back. She was shaking slightly by the time she reached her horse, not from cold but from the specific aftermath of adrenaline that comes from holding yourself very still in a difficult situation. She stood with her forehead against her horse's neck for a moment and breathed. She told David that evening at the camp on his south edge, sitting by the fire he'd built. He listened without interrupting, and when she finished there was a silence, and then he said very quietly, "He is trying to frighten you. I know. Are you frightened?" She thought about answering in the easy, proud way. She decided against it. "A little," she said, "but not enough to leave." He looked at her across the fire. The flames were small and orange in the cold air, throwing warmth in a close circle against the winter dark. His face was serious and warm at once. "Louise," he said, "I need to ask you something important." She waited. "I know we said to be careful," he said. "I know it has not been long, not long enough by the measure of most people. And I know that what I'm going to say might be exactly the wrong moment to say it, with Hooper and the land and the winter." He paused. "But I think the moment I'm in is the only one I have, and I don't want to miss it for the sake of a better occasion that might not arrive." "David," she said very quietly. "I love you," he said. I have loved you since the auction house, since you sat in the back of that room with $43 in your skirt hem and your chin at exactly the right angle, and I thought, this woman is not going to flinch, and I was right. He leaned forward slightly. I want to marry you. I want to build a proper house on this land, on both our land, and I want to do it with you. I want you to be my wife, Louise Bailey, if you'll have me. The fire crackled. The night was very cold and very clear, the kind of winter sky over Kansas that is so full of stars it seems impossible, and Louise sat across from David Alden and felt something that had been carefully and necessarily held closed for a long time open, fully open, like a window on the first warm day of spring. Yes, she said, I will have you. He reached across the fire and took her hand. They were married in the Methodist Church in Caldwell in February of 1883, on a Saturday that was improbably mild, the kind of late winter day that appears occasionally on the plains, as though the season is making a concession. Sheriff Briggs came, and Calvin Pratt, who had witnessed their land agreement and seemed pleased to witness their marriage as a kind of symmetry, and the ladies of the Methodist Church who had fed Louise in the hard months after Thomas died, and a handful of David's acquaintances from the cattle drive days, weathered men who sat in the pews with the slightly uncomfortable formality of people who did not often wear their good clothes. Louise wore her blue dress, the one she had brought from Ohio, which was the nicest thing she owned, and she carried a small bunch of winter-dried flowers that one of the church ladies had saved from the previous autumn. Gerald Hooper was not present and was not invited. After the service, there was a modest celebration at the hotel, with good food and some music and the particular warmth of a room full of people who are genuinely happy for the two people at the center of it. David danced with Louise to a fiddle played by a man named Rodriguez who was the best musician in Caldwell and knew it, and they were not accomplished dancers, neither of them, but they moved together with the ease of people who are comfortable in each other's presence, and it did not matter. They went home to the land that night. The spring that followed was the fullest season Louise could remember. The winter wheat came up with the March thaw, green and strong, pushing through the dark soil of the bottom land along Bluff Creek with the impersonal determination of things that are supposed to grow growing. David began work on the house in earnest, the proper house they had planned through the winter, with a larger room and a kitchen, and a second room that they both understood without needing to name it, was for the future. He was a careful builder, precise and methodical, learning from a man in town named Sorensen who had been building in Kansas for 15 years and knew how to put up a frame that would hold against the plains wind. Louise helped where she could and managed the rest of the land work in the hours when building was happening, and they moved through the days with the particular satisfaction of people working toward a shared, visible, achievable thing. The house took 2 months to complete. In May they moved into it, from old Sela's marshes shelter into rooms they had built themselves, and Louise stood in the kitchen for a long moment on the first evening, with the light coming in through the window David had fitted with real glass from Wichita, and felt something settle in her that had been unsettled for a very long time. David came up behind her and put his hands on her shoulders and looked out the window with her at the wheat field and the creek and the cottonwoods along the bank with their new spring leaves. "We built this," she said. "We did," he said. In June, the harvest agreement with the neighboring farms bore its first fruit. 3 farms cooperated in the harvest, sharing tools and labor and time, and Louise's yield from the 40 acres was better than her most optimistic projection. After the grain was sold and the accounts settled, she sat at the table in the new kitchen and worked through the numbers in her careful columns, and she looked up at David and said, "I can pay off 1/3 of what I owe you from the original sale." He was sitting across from her, reading a newspaper that was 3 weeks old because that was how newspapers arrived in Caldwell, and he looked up. "Send it to the land office," he said. "Keep the rest in reserve for the next season." She looked at him. "You don't need it." "My own harvest is coming in," he said. "I'm doing well enough." She put her pen down. "David, are you managing? I promise you I am managing. Because if you're not, I need to know. We are partners in this, not just in the marriage but in the arithmetic of it, and I won't have you being generous at the cost of your own stability." He put the newspaper down and looked at her with that expression she had come to know well, the one that was serious and warm at once, that she privately thought of as his most true face. "I am managing," he said, "and I want you to know that even if I weren't, the money is not the thing I'm owed by you." Louise looked at him for a moment. "What are you owed by me?" she asked. "Everything you are," he said simply, "which you give me every day." She reached across the table and took his hand. That summer, Gerald Hooper made his final move. He filed a challenge with the county land office, claiming a survey discrepancy in the recorded boundaries of Parcel 7. It was a calculated maneuver, the kind that required money and a cooperative surveyor and a willingness to weaponize bureaucratic process. And it was, Louise learned from the county clerk, not without precedent. Hooper had done something similar to a farmer named Prescott 3 years earlier, and the resulting legal confusion had eventually driven Prescott to sell at a loss. Louise went to David with the papers the county clerk had given her. They sat at the kitchen table and read them together, carefully, and David's jaw was tight in the way it had been tight outside the hotel in November. "He's claiming the eastern fence line is 6 feet inside his own property," Louise said. "The eastern fence line is where the survey says it is," David said, "which is what we will need to demonstrate." They hired a lawyer from Wichita named Garrett, a young man with a methodical mind who came to Caldwell and reviewed the original survey records and the records filed by Hooper's surveyor, and who found, with the patience of someone who enjoyed finding things, that Hooper's surveyor had used a reference point from a different parcel entirely. It was not an innocent error. When Garrett laid the two surveys side by side, the discrepancy was clear and deliberate. The hearing was held in the county courthouse in October of 1883. Louise and David sat on one side of a long table, and Gerald Hooper and his lawyer sat on the other, and the county land commissioner, a man named Hartwell who was known for being incorruptible if somewhat slow, listened to both presentations with impartial patience. Gerald Hooper was not accustomed to being presented with evidence of his own dishonesty in a formal setting. He had a large face, and it showed his feelings more than he perhaps intended, moving through irritation and contempt, and something close to genuine anger, as Garrett methodically laid out the discrepancy and its probable origins. Hartwell looked at the surveys for a long time. He asked 3 questions of each side. He looked at the surveys again. He ruled in Louise's favor. Outside the courthouse, in the pale October sunlight, David was holding the door for her, and they walked out together into the sharp autumn air, and Louise stopped on the courthouse steps and stood for a moment with the specific feeling of a battle concluded. "It's over," she said. "It's over," David agreed. Hooper and his lawyer passed them on the steps on the way out, and Hooper looked at Louise with an expression that had collapsed from contempt into something less comfortable, something that in a smaller man might have been called acknowledgement. He did not stop. He did not speak. He walked to his carriage and got in and drove away. Louise watched him go. "He'll leave it alone now," David said. "Men like that don't put good money after bad indefinitely." "I know," she said. And then, because it was true and felt important to say, "I am very glad you were in that auction house." David looked at her. "So am I," he said. He took her hand on the courthouse steps, in full view of anyone passing, which in 1882 in a Kansas county town was a statement of itself, and they walked together back toward where they had tied their horses. The seasons moved. The work continued. David completed his own house on the north parcel, and they used it for storage and for visiting hands during harvest, because they were both practical people who saw no reason to waste a good structure. The two properties operated together with the easy efficiency of an arrangement designed by people who understood each other's needs and capabilities. The winter of 1883 going into 1884 was hard, the kind of hard that tested everything, with cold that settled into the county and did not lift for weeks and snow that came in January and stayed until March. Louise and David worked through it with the steady pace of people who had chosen a hard life and continued to choose it every morning when they got up before dawn. In the evenings they read, when the lamp oil held, and they talked, the conversations of two people who had the particular pleasure of discovering that they were more interesting to each other the longer they knew each other rather than less. David had a mind that moved in careful, unexpected ways, finding the connecting tissue between things that seemed unrelated. Louise had a precision of observation that he found endlessly absorbing. They argued sometimes about land management and about politics, and once about the best way to mend a harness, and the arguments were the kind that produced clarity rather than damage. In the spring of 1884, Louise told David she was expecting a child. She told him in the kitchen over coffee, with the directness that was fundamental to her nature, and David Alden looked at her for a moment, and then he set down his cup and came around the table and held her, not dramatically, not theatrically, but with the specific and deliberate warmth of a man expressing something that words had not yet caught up to. "Are you well?" he asked, against her hair. "Very well," she said. "A little tired, but very well." "Good," he said, and then quietly, "Good." They wrote to Louise's mother in Ohio, who had worried through every development of her daughter's Kansas life with the faithful anxiety of a woman who loved her child and did not understand the terrain she had chosen. The letter back came 6 weeks later, full of her mother's feelings, which were warm and complicated and entirely characteristic. The pregnancy moved through the summer with the same honest straightforwardness that Louise brought to everything. Not easy, particularly in the heat of July and August, when the plains sun was merciless, but steady. She continued working with modifications, because she was not the kind of person who stopped working, and David worked beside her with the watchful, careful attention of a man who was finding the balance between being helpful and being overbearing, and managed it, generally, by listening when she told him which was which. The harvest of 1884 was their best yet. The bottom land along Bluff Creek had not disappointed its promise. The wheat came in strong, and the kitchen garden had produced all summer, and the chickens that Louise had acquired in the spring were doing what chickens do with satisfying regularity. When the harvest was in and the accounts were settled, Louise paid the second third of what she owed David from the original sale, and the land was nearly hers outright. David held the receipt in his hands for a moment after she gave it to him. "One more year," he said. "One more good year," she agreed. In October of 1884, on a Thursday morning when the cottonwoods along Bluff Creek were fully gold, and the air had the clean, cold clarity of the plains in autumn, Louise and David's son was born. He was healthy and loud, and possessed from the first moments of an extremely clear opinion about his situation, which Louise took as a hopeful sign regarding his character. They named him Thomas James Alden, Thomas for Louise's late husband out of a respect that was quiet and genuine, James for David's father, whom David had not known well but thought of sometimes. David sat beside the bed in the lamplight with his son in his arms and looked at Louise with an expression she had never seen on his face before, something that was beyond happiness, something more fundamental than happiness, the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he did not know he was traveling toward. "Hello, Thomas," he said, very quietly to the baby. Thomas looked back at him with the unfocused intensity of a brand new person registering the world. Louise watched them both and felt the full and complicated weight of a life that had not been what she planned but was, in every meaningful way, what she wanted. The winter of 1884 was cold but not so brutal as the previous year. Thomas grew with the enthusiastic energy of a baby who did not see any reason to take his time about anything, and the house on Bluff Creek was different with him in it, fuller, louder, more permanently inhabited somehow, as though a house requires the complete demonstration of a family to become entirely itself. David was a father the way he was everything else, careful and serious and genuinely interested. He talked to Thomas from the beginning, narrating the work of the ranch, the names of things, the habits of the creek in different seasons, with the patient attention of someone who believed the baby was more present and more receptive than most people assumed. Louise watched this and found it deeply, specifically moving, in a way she had not anticipated and did not feel it necessary to fully explain, even to herself. In the spring of 1885, the final payment on the land came due. Louise had the money. It had been a third hard year of good work, and the harvest agreement with the neighboring farms had deepened into something more like a genuine cooperative, with 5 farms now sharing equipment and labor and marketing the grain collectively, which produced better prices than any of them could negotiate alone. This had been David's suggestion, actually, offered quietly at a neighbor's kitchen table the previous autumn, and it had taken hold the way practical ideas take hold in communities of practical people. She went to the land office in May of 1885 and made the final payment and received the deed, fully paid and clear, with her name on it. Louise Alden, formerly Bailey. She stood on the steps of the land office in Caldwell, Kansas, with the deed in her hand, and the May sun was warm, not the merciless summer sun but the gentle, promising sun of a plain spring, and she thought about the auction house 3 years earlier, about $43 in her skirt hem, and a room full of men who had expected her to fail. She thought about a stranger in a black coat who had bid once and never looked away. She folded the deed and put it in her pocket and went to find her husband. He was at the livery, where he still occasionally worked for Sorensen's brother-in-law who had taken over the stable the previous year, not because he needed the money now, but because he was the kind of person who honored commitments and the commitment had been made in a leaner time. He came out into the sunshine when she appeared in the doorway, wiping his hands on a cloth, and looked at her face and knew immediately. "It's done," he said. "It's done," she said. He came to her and she showed him the deed and he read it carefully, the way he read everything, and then he looked at her. "Fully yours," he said. "Fully ours," she corrected. He looked at her for a moment, and then he smiled, the full smile, the one that was rare enough to be significant, and he folded her into his arms right there in the doorway of the livery stable in the middle of Caldwell, Kansas, on a May morning, and she laughed, which was not something she did frequently and was therefore a sound of particular quality when it happened. "We need to celebrate," he said. "Thomas needs new shoes," she said, "and the well casing needs work before summer." "We can do all of that," he said, "and still celebrate." They had a dinner that evening at the hotel, which was an extravagance they had not permitted themselves since their wedding 2 years earlier, and they sat at a table by the window with Thomas between them, in a chair that the hotel staff produced with the slightly baffled goodwill of people who did not often set up high chairs. And Louise had good beef and David had good beef, and Thomas was entirely unimpressed by the hotel's attempts at applesauce. And they sat in the warm lamplight of the hotel dining room while Caldwell went about its evening business outside the window. "3 years ago today," David said, "give or take a week." Louise looked at him. "You remember the date of the auction?" "I remember everything about that morning," he said. "The fly against the window, the sound of the gavel, you in the back of the room with your chin up." Louise felt warmth move through her. "You made a decision about me before you had any real information," she said. "I made a decision based on what I could see," he said, "which was enough." "That's not always wise," she said. "No," he agreed. "It was either wise or extraordinarily lucky. I've decided not to examine which too closely." She looked at him across the table with the particular quality of attention that comes from knowing someone well enough to see the layers of them, the man and the history of the man and the person he had chosen to become. And she thought about the fact that, in a different version of events, David Alden might never have come to that auction house, might have been 5 minutes later or 5 miles away, or simply decided on a different parcel. and the absence of him from the past 3 years was so inconceivable she had to actively put the thought aside. "I love you," she said, the same simple directness with which she said everything. "I love you," he said, the same way. Thomas, between them, threw his spoon on the floor. They both looked at him and then at each other, and the laughter that followed was easy and complete. The years moved as years do in the deliberate, season-by-season rhythm of a farming life. The cooperative that David had suggested grew to include 7 farms by 1887 and had attracted the attention of the County Agricultural Society, who sent a representative to visit and produced a report that mentioned the Bluff Creek Cooperative as a model worth replicating. This was the kind of attention that produced both satisfaction and mild embarrassment, and David received the representative with characteristic brevity, and Louise talked to him for 2 hours about soil management and the economics of collective marketing, and the representative left considerably better informed than he had arrived. Thomas grew. He was a boy of strong opinions and considerable physical energy, born with his mother's precision of observation and his father's patience, which made him simultaneously exhausting and fascinating to parent. He followed David through the work of the land with the relentless curiosity of a child who wants to understand the mechanism of things, and he sat with Louise at the kitchen table doing the arithmetic she set him, not without complaint, but with ultimate determination. In the fall of 1886, Louise told David she was expecting again. This pregnancy was harder than the first, the heat of the summer months more taxing, the work of managing a working farm with a 3-year-old more demanding than the relative simplicity of the first year. Louise did not complain about this, because complaining was not her nature, but David was observant, and he took on more quietly, without making it into a thing to be discussed. And she allowed this because she had learned in the years of their marriage that accepting help from someone who offered it freely was not weakness but wisdom. In March of 1887, on a night when the creek was just beginning to break from its winter freeze, and the air smelled of the particular muddy promise of an early Kansas spring, their daughter was born. They named her Margaret, after Louise's mother, who had finally made the journey west the previous summer to meet Thomas, and had stayed for 3 weeks and gone home shaking her head at the wind, but with a visible and genuine peace about her daughter's life. Margaret arrived with a quietness that was the direct opposite of her brother's debut, and lay in David's arms in the lamplight with the composed serenity of someone who had made her own peace with the situation. "She already looks like she's solved a problem," David said. "She looks like my mother," Louise said. "That tracks," David said, with the specific dry affection of a man who was fond of his mother-in-law and was also clear-eyed about her. Thomas was told of his sister the following morning and received this information with 3-year-old gravity, examining her for a long moment before announcing that she was quite small. This was agreed to be true. He remained at the level of polite interest for several weeks before the attachment between them began to form, quietly, in the way the attachments of children form, through proximity and time and the accumulation of small shared moments. Caldwell itself was changing through these years, as the cattle town era of Kansas was changing. The great trail drives that had made the town were winding down as the railroad expanded and fencing reduced the open range, and the town was settling into a different kind of permanence, more agricultural, more institutional, more like the place it would be for the next generation than the place it had been for the last. Louise felt this as a kind of completion, a shift from the wild, open, dangerous energy of a cattle town towards something that required different virtues, patience and steadiness, and commitment to a particular piece of ground. These were virtues she had in considerable quantity. David, for his part, had become something of a fixture in the county, not in the way of a prominent man who seeks prominence, but in the way of a man who does his work reliably, and is honest in his dealings and turns up when something needs doing, And these things accumulate quietly over years into a reputation that has no particular drama, but is more durable than drama. He became involved in the County Agricultural Society in 1888, joining the cooperative's representative committee, and he brought to the meetings the same quality he brought to everything: careful listening and then precise, relevant contribution, and the other farmers noticed and valued it. In the spring of 1889, after 6 years of hard, good work, the farm was producing enough that they hired 2 hands for the harvest season, young men from a farm family in the next county who were honest workers and needed the employment. And this was the year Louise allowed herself to recognize that what she had built was not merely surviving, but genuinely thriving. She stood at the edge of the wheat field one morning in May of 1889, the wheat knee-high and moving in the slow, constant plains wind, and she thought about the auction house and the $43 and the woman she had been in that room, carefully still, willing herself not to flinch. She thought about all the iterations of herself that had come between that morning and this one: the widow who had refused charity, the farmer who had worked the frozen ground, the wife who had sat across a fire and said yes. She thought about what it meant to build a life, not to receive one or inherit one, but to build one, from the particular combination of effort and luck and love and stubbornness that had produced this field, this house, these children, this man. She heard boots on the dry grass and turned. David came up beside her and stood looking at the wheat with the same expression, the careful, satisfied attention of a man taking stock. "Thomas wants to help with the planting this week," he said. "Thomas is 6, Louise said. "He can help with the less demanding aspects." "He will not accept that framing," David said. "No," Louise agreed. "He will not." A pause. The wheat moved. A hawk turned high above the field in a wide circle. "Louise," David said. She looked at him. "I want to tell you something," he said. He was looking at the field still, in the way of a man who sometimes says things more easily when he is not looking directly at the person he is saying them to. "I think about the auction house sometimes. About what it would have been if I hadn't gone in that morning, or if I'd gone in earlier and missed seeing you, or if I'd been different then than I was." "What kind of different?" she asked. "Still the man I was before Ellsworth," he said. "Still working for men like Hooper. I think about that version of myself and I don't recognize him entirely, but I recognize him enough." Louise was quiet, listening. "I want you to know," he said, "that every choice I made after Ellsworth was toward this. Not toward this specifically, because I didn't know this existed, but toward the kind of life where this could exist. Where I could stand in a field with a woman I love and 2 good children and work that means something and not owe anyone an apology for how I live." He paused. "I want you to know that." Louise looked at him for a moment, at the profile of his face against the blue Kansas sky, at the lines that the years had added, the particular quality of his hands at rest at his sides. "I know," she said. "And I want you to know that the version of you that walked through that door in July of 1882, whatever else he was or had been, was the best thing that walked through any door in my life." He looked at her now. "Even Thomas," she said, and there was something in her voice that was light and deliberate. He smiled. "Mrs. Alden," he said, "that is a very unkind question." She laughed. He took her hand. They stood in the wheat field on a May morning in 1889, the plains wind moving through the grain, the hawk still circling overhead, the children's voices audible from the direction of the house, and the creek running along the south edge of the field, the way it always ran, consistent and clear and entirely indifferent to the human lives it nourished. And Louise Bailey Alden and David Alden stood in the middle of all of it, and simply were where they were. There is a particular kind of happiness that does not announce itself, that does not arrive in a single moment or resolve into a single feeling, but is instead the accumulation of chosen days, of work and rest, and argument and laughter, and the ordinary repeated intimacy of 2 people deciding, every morning, to continue building the thing they started. It is the happiness of people who have earned it through the specific unglamorous work of staying, of repairing, of showing up at the fence line, and the kitchen table, and the bedside of a sick child, and the field that needs planting whether or not you feel equal to it. Louise had not known to call it happiness when she was in the middle of its hardest passages. She had called it necessary. She had called it the only option. She had called it what you do when you cannot do otherwise. But standing in the wheat field with the May sun warm and David's hand in hers, she was willing, for once, to give it its right name. Margaret was 2 and Thomas was 6, and the wheat was growing and the land was paid for in hers. And the man beside her had bid once in an auction house and never looked away. And this was her life, whole and real and fully, irreversibly her own. In the summer of 1889, they made a discovery about the northern corner of David's parcel, the portion that had always been dry and rocky and considered marginal, which turned out to have a small spring running beneath a limestone shelf, accessible if you dug at the right angle. One of the hired hands found it by accident while working on a drainage problem, and when the spring was properly opened, it produced good clean water with the steady reliability of something that had been waiting, underground, for someone to pay attention. David stood looking at the small pool of spring water with the expression of a man receiving unexpected good news, which was not something he was entirely accustomed to receiving with ease. "Well," he said. "Indeed," Louise said. "This changes what I can plant up there," he said. "It changes everything up there," she said. "With reliable water you can take that whole northern section, the rocky part, and put in an orchard." He looked at her. "An orchard. Apple trees primarily," she said. "Maybe some peach if the frosts cooperate. It takes years to establish, obviously, but the soil under that limestone layer is good. I looked at it last spring, and an established orchard on the hill above the bottom land produces through drought years when the grain doesn't." He looked at her with that expression, the warm and serious one. "You've been thinking about this for a while," he said. "Since last spring," she said. "I was waiting to see if the water idea held up." He looked at the spring. He looked at her. "All right," he said. "Let's plant an orchard." They ordered the trees through the County Agricultural Cooperative the following spring, 20 apple trees from a nursery in Missouri and a dozen peach. And David and Thomas planted them together on a Saturday in April of 1890. Thomas, now 7 and old enough to carry a bucket of water without spilling most of it, which was the primary qualification David had established. Margaret, 3 years old and possessed of her grandmother's direct manner, supervised from a blanket spread on the grass at the edge of the orchard site, and offered commentary that was not always welcome and always specific. Louise watched from the porch of the house, with the particular pleasure of watching people you love do a thing they are doing well and happily. The trees went in the ground in neat rows, small and bare-limbed and requiring of imagination to see as the thing they would eventually become, and Thomas patted the soil around each one with a seriousness that was entirely characteristic. When they were done, David and Thomas came and sat on the porch with Louise and Margaret, and they looked at the field of small stakes with their accompanying little trees, and it was quiet for a moment. "They look very small," Thomas said. "They are very small," David said. "Right now. When will they be big?" "Some years from now," David said. "You'll be older than me when they reach their full size." Thomas considered this. "That's too long." "Most things worth having take time," Louise said. Thomas looked at her with the evaluating expression of a child processing information they are not entirely happy about. "You always say that," he said. "Because it is always true," she said. He thought about this. "All right," he said with the air of someone granting a concession. He looked at the orchard. "I still think they should grow faster." David looked at Louise. She looked at him. The spring evening settled around them, warm and quiet, and the orchard of small trees stood in the late light. The years built on each other the way years do on good land with good work. The wheat harvests continued strong, with the cooperative now covering 11 farms, and producing enough volume to negotiate genuinely favorable contracts with the grain buyers out of Wichita. David served on the county board for 3 terms, from 1891 to 1897, doing the work of local governance with the same reliable attention he brought to everything. And Louise was frequently the sharper thinker in the conversations he brought home from meetings, which he acknowledged freely, and which the men on the board never knew. Gerald Hooper left Caldwell in 1892, moved to Wichita in pursuit of larger operations, and was heard from occasionally through the county gossip network with the diminishing frequency of someone whose relevance has passed. Louise felt nothing in particular about this. She had spent no significant energy on Hooper since the land office victory in 1883 and had none to spare for his departure. Thomas, at 10, was already working the farm with something beyond the energy of a child doing chores. He had his mother's competence and his father's patience, and a specific instinct for the land that surprised both of them sometimes with its maturity. He would stand at the edge of the wheat field and look at the growth pattern with an attention that no one had taught him and occasionally say something precise and correct about what the crop needed. "He is going to be a farmer," David said one evening, watching Thomas cross the yard in the way Thomas crossed every space with intent and direction. "He is already a farmer," Louise said. "He is 10 and he is already a farmer." "Is that what you want for him?" David asked. Louise considered this honestly. "I want for him what he wants for himself," she said. "If he wants this land, it will be here. If he wants something else, I want to have raised him capable of getting it." David nodded. "Margaret will want to read everything ever written," he said. "I know," Louise said. "She is already trying." Margaret, at 7, had consumed every book in the house twice and was working through the county schoolteacher's personal library with a speed that alarmed the schoolteacher. She had her mother's precision and her grandmother's directness, and an additional quality that belonged to neither of them, a kind of joyful intellectual veracity that was entirely her own. Louise's mother came west again in 1893, and this time she stayed for the winter, which none of them had exactly planned but which turned out to be the right thing. She was older now, and the Ohio winters had become harder on her, and the Kansas winter, though cold, had a dryness that suited her better. She sat at the kitchen table with Margaret doing reading, and with Thomas doing arithmetic, and with Louise in the evenings talking about things that mothers and daughters talk about when they have finally arrived at the stage of the relationship where they are also simply friends. She talked to David, too, in the gradual, patient way of a woman assessing a man who had married her daughter, and somewhere in December she told Louise, with the directness that Margaret had clearly inherited, "He is exactly what you needed and what you deserved." Louise thought about this for a while before she answered. "Yes," she said, "he is." Her mother went home to Ohio in March with promises to return, and she kept those promises for 3 more years before age and distance made the journey too difficult. She died in Ohio in the spring of 1896, peacefully in her own house, surrounded by the comfortable order she had always maintained, and Louise sat on the porch of the house on Bluff Creek in the April evening and cried, which she did not often do, and which David recognized as requiring only presence, not words. He sat beside her and said nothing, and that was exactly right. She wrote the letters that needed writing and made the arrangements that needed making, and kept the grief in its proper place, which was real and present and hers, and she continued. The orchard came into its first real bearing in 1897. 8 years after planting, the apple trees had grown into the substantial, graceful presences that Thomas had considered too slow to arrive, and in September of that year they produced their first serious crop. Thomas, now 14 and already the height of his father, harvested apples with Margaret, 10, on a warm September Saturday, and Louise made apple butter and dried apple rings and a pie, and the pie was on the table that evening with the particular sweetness of something you have been patient for. David took the first bite and said nothing for a moment. "Well," Thomas said. "Worth the wait," David said. Thomas, who was now old enough to appreciate this callback to the porch conversation 7 years earlier, looked at his father and then at his mother with an expression that was trying not to be amused and failing. "You planned that," he said. "I planned nothing," David said. "The apple just tasted good." The apple butter and the dried rings sold well at the county market. The peaches had not come in with the same regularity, the frosts catching them some years, but what they produced was worth having, and the orchard became a feature of the land's identity. The thing people mentioned when they mentioned the Alden farm, in addition to the wheat and the cooperative and the house that could be seen from the county road with its real glass windows and its good roof. In 1900, on the first day of the new century, Louise and David sat on the porch in the cold January morning and watched the sunrise come up gold and flat over the Kansas plains. Thomas was in the barn. Margaret was still inside, having decided the new century did not require her presence before the sun was fully up, which was a reasonable position and was respected. The sunrise was extraordinary, the particular combination of cold air and low cloud that makes the Kansas sky do things at dawn that seem excessive but are entirely honest. Colors that start at the horizon and move upward in bands of red and orange and gold until they soften into the pale blue of the January morning. 18 years, David said. Louise looked at him. He was looking at the sunrise with the expression he had when he was calculating something, not arithmetic but something less specific. "Since the auction house," he said. 18 years, she agreed. "Thomas was born 3 years after that," he said. "Margaret 5 years after. The orchard is coming into its full bearing. The cooperative is well established." He paused. "We've done a lot in 18 years. "We have," she said. He looked at her. "You sat in the back of that room with $43 and your chin at the right angle," he said, "and I thought I was walking in to bid on land. And then I saw you and I understood that the land was incidental." Louise smiled. "That is a considerable revision of events," she said. "It is the accurate version of events," he said. "I have told you this before." "You have," she said. He took her hand on the porch in the January cold, with the new century's first sunrise rolling up over the plains in front of them. His hand was warm against hers, the familiar warm weight of 18 years, the hand that had helped build a fence and a house and a life. "I would like to tell you something," he said, which was his way of beginning something he had thought about for a while. "Tell me," she said. "I did not know," he said, "when I walked into that auction house, that I was walking into the best morning of my life. I thought I was making a practical decision about land. But standing in the back of that room and watching you sit with all that quiet courage and thinking, I need to do something about this, that was the clearest I have ever been about anything. Clearer than I have been about crops or weather or any practical thing." He looked at her. "You made me clear." Louise was quiet for a moment. The sunrise was moving as sunrises do, from the dramatic to the ordinary, the gold settling into the flat blue of the winter day. "David," she said. "Yes," he said. "You were the most significant thing that ever happened to me," she said. "And I walked into that auction house expecting to fight for a piece of land, and instead I ended up fighting for everything worth having. Because you were there, and because you bid once and you looked at me like I was the whole point of the room." She paused. "I want you to know that I have never, not for one day, regretted saying yes to you." He looked at her with the warm, serious face. "Nor I to you," he said. They sat on the porch in the first morning of the new century and watched the light move across the bottom land of Bluff Creek, across the wheat field and the orchard on the hill, and the fence line where Louise had once stood with a rifle across her arm, across the creek itself running clear and consistent through the January cold, across the land that was hers and his and theirs, built payment by payment and season by season and day by chosen day. Thomas came out of the barn and crossed the yard toward the house, moving with the easy, deliberate pace he had inherited from his father, tall and purposeful at 16. He looked at them on the porch as he passed. "You're letting the cold in," he said, which was a practical observation about the open porch door behind them. The cold was invited, Louise said. Thomas looked at them with the expression of a young man who had grown up watching his parents be exactly themselves and had developed a specific tolerance for this quality. "Happy New Year," he said, and went inside. Margaret appeared at the doorway, wrapped in a blanket, her hair still loose from sleep, holding a book she had been reading. She was 10 and she looked at the world with large, considering eyes, and she said, "Is the new century interesting yet?" "It is very new," David said. "Give it time." "That's what you always say about things," she said. "That is because it is always true about things," he said. She looked at the sunrise, which was now fully resolved into the pale January morning. It was a good sunrise, she acknowledged, with the particular generosity of a person making a concession. She went back inside. Louise looked at David. He looked at her. They sat together on the porch of the house they had built, on the land she had fought for, in the life they had made from $43 and a man who bid once and never looked away. And the first morning of the 20th century moved on above them, and the creek ran and the orchard stood, and the children went about their business inside, and it was all ordinary and all extraordinary, as the best things always are. The creek ran all that year and the next, through the Kansas droughts and the good rains and the years in between. The wheat grew and was harvested and grew again. The orchard reached its full, magnificent maturity. The apple trees in September so laden that the branches required propping. The fruit coming off in boxes that were sold at the county market, and at markets in Caldwell, and eventually in small quantities, to a buyer in Wichita who had heard about them, and made the trip to taste them and stayed for dinner, and went home with a standing order. Thomas, at 20, began courting a girl named Ruth from the neighboring cooperative farm, a steady young woman with a good laugh who helped with the planting the summer she and Thomas became serious, and who fitted into the rhythm of the farm with the ease of someone who understood what a working life required. Louise watched this with the particular pleasure of a mother seeing her child choose well. Margaret, at 17, was already writing letters to the county normal school about the possibility of teaching certification, her letters precise and persuasive, and clearly the work of someone who had read everything and wanted to do something with it. And David drove her to the county seat to discuss the matter with the school administration, and sat in the waiting room with the patience he had been exercising all his life, while Margaret persuaded a skeptical administrator that she was ready. She was ready. She left for the normal school in the fall of 1904, with a trunk packed by Louise and a new notebook purchased by David and Thomas's parting advice, which was to write more often than she thought necessary, delivered with the gruff affection of an older brother. She wrote more often than was necessary, and it was never enough. The farm continued. The cooperative had become, by 1905, a formal agricultural association with 11 member farms, a shared equipment barn near the county road, and a collective marketing agreement that produced prices 20% better than any single farm could obtain. David stepped back from the leadership of the association that year, handing it to a younger man, a second-generation farmer named Hendricks who had grown up watching the cooperative work and had good ideas about its future. "You're not tired of it," Louise said when he told her. "No," he said, "but it's time for someone else's hands on it. I built the first part. Hendricks will build the next." She understood this. It was the same instinct she had about the farm itself, about the orchard that Thomas would eventually tend, and the house that would eventually be his. The understanding that building something well means building it so it can outlast you. In 1906, Thomas and Ruth were married in the Methodist Church in Caldwell, with the same minister who had married Louise and David 23 years earlier, and the celebration was louder and more crowded than the first wedding, full of cooperative farm families and neighboring ranchers, and the two families joining together with the specific warmth of communities that have decided they like each other. Louise stood in the church and watched her son marry, and felt the particular fullness of a woman whose life has been long enough to witness its own continuation. David stood beside her and held her hand and did not say anything, which was exactly right. Ruth was a good addition to the Alden household, practical and warm, and possessed of a patience that Thomas, with his energy and decisiveness, occasionally required. She began learning the farm's operations with the same serious attention Louise recognized from her own first year on the land, and Louise taught her what she knew with the directness that had always been her way. In the summer of 1907, Thomas and Ruth's son was born. They named him Daniel, not after David but after Ruth's father, which was appropriate and right. And when David held his grandson for the first time, he looked at the baby, and then at Louise with an expression that carried all the years in it, all the way back to a summer morning in 1882 when he had walked through a door and looked at a woman in a brown calico dress and understood, with the specific clarity of someone who has spent years being confused about what they want, that they had just found it. "We are grandparents," Louise said. "We are," he said, still looking at her. "How do you feel about that?" "I feel," he said, "that I am the luckiest man in Kansas, and I have felt that since the summer of 1882, and it gets more true rather than less." She took the baby from him and held her grandson and looked out the window of the house they had built, at the orchard on the hill and the wheat field below it and the creek running clear along the south edge, and she thought, this is what came from $43 and a stranger who bid once. Margaret came home from teaching in the spring of 1908, between terms, and spent 6 weeks on the farm, helping with the planting and entertaining Daniel, who was 8 months old and receptive to entertainment. She had become, over 4 years of teaching, exactly the teacher Louise had known she would become, exacting and enthusiastic and deeply respected by students who were initially intimidated and eventually devoted. She had also, she told her mother one evening in the kitchen with the directness that was genetic, met a man, a schoolteacher from the next county named William Harris, who was kind and intelligent, and whose opinion of women's education was, she reported, unusually enlightened for the time. Louise listened to this with the attention it deserved. "Bring him to meet us," she said. "I intend to," Margaret said. "I wanted to tell you first." Louise looked at her daughter, who was 21 and sure of herself, and still the girl who had supervised an apple orchard planting from a blanket at age 3. "Are you happy?" she asked. "I am very happy," Margaret said. "I am going to be a teacher, and I am going to keep reading everything ever written, and I am going to be happy about both of those things indefinitely." Louise smiled. "Good," she said. William Harris came to the farm in August of 1908. A tall, quiet man with spectacles and an impressive command of agricultural history that won David's interest within 20 minutes and never lost it. He was clearly and genuinely in love with Margaret, in the unassuming way of someone who has found what they were looking for and is not particularly interested in performing about it. Louise liked him immediately and said so, which was not her habit with people she had just met. But she had learned over the years that honesty offered at the right moment is its own kind of gift. Margaret and William married in the spring of 1909, and the church in Caldwell had now seen 3 generations of Aldens through its doors in varying configurations, which the current minister, a younger man than the one who had married Louise and David, noted with warm amusement when he said so in his brief remarks. The farm in 1909 was producing abundantly and consistently. Thomas had taken over the primary management of the daily operations, with David working alongside him rather than ahead of him, in the natural transition of a working farm from one generation to the next. Ruth managed the household and the kitchen garden and the chickens with the same competence she had brought to everything since her first year there. Daniel, 2 years old, was already following Thomas around the farm with the focused energy that seemed to be a quality that Alden men carried into the world from the start. Louise, at 53, still worked the land alongside everyone else, not from stubbornness but from love, from the specific attachment to a piece of ground that had cost her everything and returned more than she had thought to ask for. She planted the kitchen garden in the spring of 1909, the way she had planted it in the spring of 1884, and every spring between, on her knees in the dark soil with the smell of May around her, and the creek running below, and the cottonwoods leafing out along the bank. David came and found her there one morning, as he had found her in the field and at the well and on the porch and in the kitchen and in all the ordinary stations of their shared life, and he sat down beside her in the garden with the ease of a man who had nowhere else he needed to be. "Thomas and Ruth are talking about expanding the north section," he said. "I know," she said. "They have good ideas about it." "They do," he said. They worked together in the garden for a while, the comfortable work of people who have done it together enough times that the coordination is instinctive, not requiring discussion. "Louise," he said. She looked at him. "Do you remember what you told me on the steps of the courthouse? After Hartwell ruled in your favor, I said it was over," she said. "Before that," he said, "you said you were glad I was in the auction house." "I remember. I want you to know," he said, "that I am glad every single day that I walk through that door. I am glad in a way that I don't have adequate language for, in a way that gets bigger rather than smaller as the years go on." He was looking at the garden, at the dark Kansas soil with the spring seedlings coming up. "I want you to know that." Louise looked at her husband. At 53, he was still the man who had walked through that door, still possessed of the same careful, steady attention, with more lines in his face and silver at his temples, and the particular quality of ease that comes from a life lived with integrity. He was still the most present person she had ever sat across from. "I know," she said. "I want you to know that I know." He looked at her. "And I want you to know," she said, "that I walked into that auction house expecting to fight alone, and I have never, not once in 27 years, had to fight alone. And that is not a small thing. That is everything." He reached over and brushed a streak of garden dirt from her cheek with his thumb, the small, entirely unceremonious gesture of a man who has been with a person long enough for tenderness to be entirely ordinary. "No," he said, "it's not a small thing." The sun was warm on the garden. The creek ran. Somewhere near the orchard Thomas was working, his voice carrying in the spring air. Inside the house Ruth was singing to Daniel, the sound drifting out through the open kitchen window. The cottonwoods along the creek were full of new leaves, pale green and trembling in the slight spring wind, and the bottom land along Bluff Creek was exactly what Louise had known it could be, exactly what she had fought for, exactly what she had planted and tended and refused to abandon. She planted a tomato seedling in the dark soil and patted it down with both hands and looked out at the field and the creek and the orchard on the hill. David worked beside her. The morning moved on above them. The land held them both. And everything that had been built was standing, and everything that had been planted was growing, and everything that had been paid for in hard work and held faith and $43 and one bid in an auction house in the summer of 1882 was here, real and whole and entirely, irrevocably theirs.